So we have looked at important tropes and elements of life in wartime for the civilian population during the 6 years that World War II lasted, from 1939 to 1945. These factors being occupation by the Nazi army and collaboration and resistance. They were very important elements for those who were alive at this time, and especially for the civilian population, and the fact that the element of resistance also had a reverberating effect on the armies that helped people liberate themselves of the Nazi occupation. Another group of people was affected very differently and much more radically by the war, and that was the Jewish population. So much so that we have another very important trope coming to our attention at this time, and this is the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a form of genocide, and that affected mainly the Jewish people, but not only them. So we have to look back a little bit as to the age-old anti-Semitism that affected the cultures of European countries for many centuries before the 20th one, being based on a sort of difference in religions or a lack of acceptance for the fact that not everybody had become Christian, that some people actually were Jewish. And this anti-Semitism becomes more acute during the 19th century, where the nationalistic ideals prevailed. Why? Because the idea was that a nation was united by the people who were in a part of a territory, people who had one religion and one language. And obviously the Jewish people had a different religion, and so they were not perceived as those who really belonged in these nations. So, but eventually anti-Semitism becomes really extreme under the Nazi regime. It becomes so extreme that the Nazi armies are intent in building these labor/concentration camps, where then they deport the Jewish population from Germany and from the other countries that they occupy, and where at some point even the idea of a final solution, namely a successful genocide, a successful elimination of all the Jewish people from the face of the earth, would be possible. And actually there are various serious attempts to implement it. Some of you are maybe familiar with names like Treblinka, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau, and these are the ominous names of these concentration camps where this attempted genocide was enacted. So we have to remember that the people who were deported by the Nazi army into these camps were, many of them were Jewish. The vast majority of them were Jewish people, but you could be deported for other reasons as well. For example, if you were suspected of being gay, or suspected of being a socialist, or having some other misalignment with the racial state, with the values of the Nazi regime, you could be easily deported. And obviously there were overlaps, because socialists and gay people are present in all ethnicities and in all social venues. Okay, so initially the idea was that these people would be prisoners in a camp where they would be forced to work, like slaves for no pay, in fact. And then there was a realization, especially when the Russian campaigns started to go badly in 1942, that it would really require a lot of implementing a lot of surveillance to keep all these people in these prison camps working and without trying to escape. So at some point in the Nazi headquarters, the idea of the final solution took sway, and so instead of labor camps, these camps became extermination camps, where all the prisoners were gassed in the gas chambers, and then where their body were burned in the crematory ovens to hide the fact. So this is the Holocaust, in which 5.7 million, it is estimated that 5.7 million Jews perished. The Holocaust is also known as the Shoah. So this is another segment of the population that was very deeply affected by the war, whose life was deeply affected during the war. And actually, the only thing that we can say about this is that fortunately the genocide was not successful, in the sense that, you know, the final solution wasn't final, and survivors of the Holocaust eventually, you know, stayed and are today with us in Israel, in many other countries where Jews are welcome. So so we could see the power of humankind to really even conceive of a project like that fortunately failed, but that gave people a sense of the extremes to which humankind could get. Okay, another big segment of the population that whose lives are affected by the war are women. Women, of course, are about half or more of the population, and we have to say that in countries that had industrialized economies, both World War I and World War II had favorable effects on the movements, on the demands of the movements that women had animated. What women wanted was access to education, access to the professions, access to paid labor, and also obviously access to the vote, which would turn them into political constituencies that then would make politicians preoccupied with their demands. Why? Because in industrialized societies, what counts is the money you make. You know, labor is paid, and so either if you're a woman, you can either want to do the type of work that is paid, or you might want to demand pay for the work that you already do, which is, say, running families, which is very hard work, but is still, even today, not paid. It's in the sort of slavery stage. So in fact, what happened in industrialized societies is that in the aftermath of World War I, women acquired the right to vote in the United States, all the different states of the Union, and in Great Britain. Partly this was a way to compensate for the big effort that women had made in the wartime period in being part of the war economy. And then the same thing happened in France and Italy after World War II. Okay. In some armies, women were in combat position, and that includes China and the Soviet Union. In Great Britain and the United States, women were not in combat positions. They were present in the medical services, they were in military hospitals, and they were powering the war economy, producing ammunitions, producing weapons, producing all the equipment and foodstuffs that served the armies. Another situation happened in Korea, where when the Japanese army invaded, Japanese soldiers used women as unpaid sex workers. In other words, they expected sexual services from these women that they did not pay for, and this is known as comfort women, using Korean women as comfort women who would comfort the Japanese soldiers. So there were all kinds of ways in which the lives of women were affected by these wars. Now we want to look at the Pacific front briefly, because it is very important. Clearly the United States has a border with the Pacific Ocean, and therefore has a strategic investment in having a say in what happens in the Pacific. Here we look at map 2 of this chapter, and we see how the Japanese army had advanced. Occupying Manchuria, controlling Manchuria, the eastern half of China, all of Indochina, and most of the Southeast Asia islands. One of the states of the United States was the archipelago, the Pacific archipelago of Hawaii, and there were naval bases there. One of the bases was Pearl Harbor. So when in 1941 the Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor, this gave the U.S. president at that time, Roosevelt, a very good reason to enter the war and persuade the American people that this was a war that was worth entering in. And then eventually the American Navy defeated Japanese Navy in two important battles in Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1944. And actually the Japanese had surrendered already at that point. But there was in store for them another episode of the war, which happened when the President Truman decided to drop two atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And here we come to the time, the 1945, when the peace agreements were negotiated. It is very important to understand that in these peace agreements is when the two superpowers that then will be the main agents, the main powers of the subsequent era really emerge. How do they emerge? First, there is a peace conference in Yalta, always in 1945. At this time, Hitler has not been completely defeated, but Berlin is surrounded by the Red Army, and clearly, Hitler and his closest circle have no escape. So Stalin is aware that, that the Red Army is capable of debunking Hitler and therefore defeating Nazism once and for all. And so this, in a way, is a conference where the USSR, represented by Stalin, dominates the table of the peace. But then President Truman drops the bombs, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then another conference takes place, the conference of Potsdam. And in this conference, the United States and its leader, President Truman, have more of a significant role in the peace agreements. Okay, how do these two superpowers emerge? We see that, at the peace table, who really counts is the powers, the military powers that have had a very significant role in defeating the common enemy, which was the German army, basically. Germany, of course, has an even worse rep than it had at the end of World War I, and so is not at all consulted at the peace table. Japan has received this blow of the atomic bombs, and so is really defeated at this point. Italy has negotiated an armistice and has turned to the other side 2 years before the war ended. And France capitulated to the Nazi army, to the Nazi invasion, and ended up being occupied by the Nazi army. Great Britain resisted, but then probably Great Britain alone would not have made it without the intervention of the United States. So basically the two countries that can attribute to themselves the defeat of Nazism, and therefore the defeat of the values that this dictatorial regime represented, including the idea of a racial state, are the United States of America and the USSR, and they will become the protagonists of the Cold War era that we will examine in the next chapter. And so we come to the fifth chapter in this part 7 of our brief global history. Part 7 is dedicated to the contemporary global realignments that were produced in the century that just ended, the 20th century. And this chapter, the fifth in this part, is dedicated to the Cold War era. Its title is The Bipolar World. So the focus will be in this chapter on what is known as the Cold War era, roughly in the years from 1948, when the USA and the USSR relations became a little more tense than they had been in the conclusion years of World War II, up to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1994. So the Cold War era is an era when the world is divided into two main areas of influence, corresponding to the two superpowers that have emerged from World War II. These two superpowers are the United States of America and the Union of the Socialist Soviet Republics of Russia. And so in map 1, we see first how the country that was blamed, that really had caused the major aggressiveness of World War II, Germany, is the first to really become divided under these areas of influence. So we have East Germany, which is under the aegis, the control of the Soviet Union, and then we have three parts of West Germany initially, one under the control of France, the other one Great Britain, and the other one the United States. Eventually these three parts become consolidated in what is known as West Germany. The city of Berlin was the traditional capital of Germany, and it is located in the area that became East Germany. So to make sure that even more of this central city, this capital city of the country, would be divided as well, within the city of Berlin, the wall is created so that Berlin becomes divided between East Berlin and West Berlin. So there's a little bit Western island within East Germany. So that's how this bipolar world manifests within the territory that had been known up to the time as Germany. Now we look more at the map of Europe and the entire world. So we remember that these areas of influence correspond to these two superpowers that have emerged from the war, but they also correspond to two military alliances. The alliance of those countries that are on the side of the US, of the United States, is called NATO, or Atlantic Alliance. And the countries that are under the aegis of the Soviet Union are part of the Warsaw Pact. Okay. But not only that, there are also two different economic philosophies that are at the base of how each system or each segment of the bipolar world functions. Economic philosophies corresponding to capitalism for the United States and its aggregate countries and regions, and communism for the Soviet Union and its aggregate countries and regions. So we see how this bipolar system deploys itself in Europe when we look at what came to be known as the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is that imaginary line within Europe that divides the Western European countries from the Eastern European countries, with the Eastern European countries all being under the jurisdiction, often the direct control of the Soviet Union. It goes along the lines of the east boundary of West Germany, and then Austria, which is actually outside, and then the east boundary of Italy, and then everything that's on the other side belongs to the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. Okay. But there is also a worldwide effect of this bipolar organization that is present in Africa, for example, where many countries that have become independent from their former European now align themselves with the Soviet Union. And in Asia, where we see that China, that has its own socialist revolution in the decade of the 50s, when the leader of the Nationalist Party of China becomes exiled in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, who actually founds like another China that doesn't become socialist in Taiwan, and eventually in China this fraternal period evolves where the two socialist countries of China and the Soviet Union go hand in hand. But eventually, under the leadership of Mao, the politics of the Great Leap Forward, which is a move to become more industrialized, and then the Cultural Revolution, which is a movement to really eliminate all the legacies of the past, even the good ones. And at that point, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, really China finds its own type of communism. Nonetheless, we see that this sort of bipolar configuration really affects every region and every continent on the planet. So it creates what is known as the Cold War order. Okay, so this Cold War order produces a bipolar world where the two main elements in the evolution of life are seen as separate, separable, and even inimical to each other. And these elements are collaboration and competition, symbiosis and individual freedom, socialism and capitalism. All of a sudden, these elements that are often integrated with each other because we always collaborate and then compete and then collaborate and compete. At all times, there's a sort of mixture of these elements, are now thought of and organized as something that can be separate in these two areas of influence. This division affected all areas of life, including scientific knowledge. Many scientists in the Soviet Union studied symbiosis, but in Western scientists didn't study symbiosis. In fact, they thought symbiosis was a medical problem. It is so in scientific knowledge production, it affects the areas of how resources are used, what technologies evolved, and what technologies are accessible to people. It affects the area of how one's personal, affectional, love, and even sexual life is organized. So it really has very wide effects at the macroscopic and the very microscopic level as well. On the other hand, now that we look at this era from a distance, now that it has ended for about 20 years, we can see that in many ways the Cold War was also a mixed blessing. It was a blessing but mixed. And let's see a little bit of how it was mixed. So the Cold War order, we can say that it provided for a certain balance in the traffic of arms and also of people. Because these movements of weapons and migratory groups were only permitted along the Cold War lines. For example, a country in Africa that was aligned with the Soviet Union could not buy weapons from the United States. Therefore, could not acquire those weapons that then would fuel some local conflicts. Just one example. People who wanted to move across the planet for whatever good reason they might have wanted to do so, in a way could not exactly go outside of that area of influence of the place of the country where they were born. So it provided for a certain balance in that respect. However, the Cold War order, or the Cold War, could easily become very hot if things got tense at strategic points along these Cold War lines. And we can look at least three examples. Korea is a peninsula off of the mainland China, and it was divided in North Korea under the influence of direct influence of socialist China, and South Korea, which was really a strategic point for the NATO allies and the United States to maintain a base in that area, also near Japan. So sure enough, in 1951, a conflict erupted between North Korea and South Korea. The United States intervened, so that was the first hot moment of the Cold War, always along these fault lines of these Cold War lines. Next, we observe the conflict of the Bay of Pigs and then the missile crisis in Cuba. Cuba had its own socialist revolution, and so now could be seen as a base that the USSR had right next to Florida, or the mainland of the United States. So that was another crisis that, as we will see, was resolved in very positive ways. Another area, another strategic point was constituted by Indochina, and especially the territory of Vietnam, which had at one point been under the influence of China, then of France, as had been a French colony, and now becomes divided into North Vietnam and South Vietnam, with North Vietnam under the direct influence of the socialist sphere, and then South Vietnam being a very important avant-post for NATO allies. And that's, what resulted in the Vietnam War, which was from 1961 to 1968. And it was the first war that the United States could not win. But then, while the Cold War order could become very hot in certain points and at certain moments, it also had its moments of detente, of relaxation. For example, when Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union, at the same time that President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was president in the United States, and that Pope John XXIII was Pope in Rome, and that Martin Luther King was the leader of the civil rights movement in the United States, all these leaders managed to create a detente. In other words, if there would be a cause for conflict, they would resolve it instead of let it escalate. And that was exactly the case of the Cuba Missile Crisis, where we know that, in fact, a third world war could have exploded at that time. It could have been the final war where atomic weapons would have destroyed everything, but it didn't happen. Why? Because the two main presidents, Khrushchev and Kennedy, wanted to collaborate on avoiding it. So it had its moments of detente. Okay. This Cold War order also produced the economic climate that allowed the second phase of the industrial evolution to come into full sway. What do we mean by the second phase of the Industrial Revolution? This phase was powered by a fossil fuel more efficient than coal. It was powered by oil or petrol, which enabled major reorganizations of human life, especially in the area of transports. If you think of land transports, cars, trucks, they were all made possible by the use of oil or petrol. If you look at maritime transport, sea cargo ships, they're all powered by oil as well. And if you look at aviation, airplanes are all powered by oil. So this new fossil fuel could be used more efficiently as a propellant for many of the new machines that were invented. And this happened under the aegis of the Cold War order. Finally, the Cold War order created a context for the unprecedented prosperity, for unprecedented numbers of people in industrialized societies. We know that there was a demographic explosion after World War II. In fact, the baby boomers ended up forming the bulk of a strong middle class in their own industrialized societies. At the same time, this prosperity produced room for an expanded participation, for the inclusion of more people based on the demands of the movements that went into action at that time. And we are talking about the 60s. For example, the civil rights and movement and the movement for racial equality in the US, which was particularly prominent due to the legacy of slavery and disenfranchisement, even after the end of slavery. The workers' rights movement, which was very important in Europe, given to the tradition of a proletarian class that learned to reclaim its rights and become more organized. The women's rights movements that again had been prominent both in Europe and in the United States, that claimed for women a role in an economy that monetized everything. In an economy where the only thing that counted was the money you made, they claimed a role in this economy. They claimed access to jobs, to the professions, to the education. They gave you access to the professions and to the vote. And also sometimes to being recognized as workers even when they were not employed, because the work of the home is very hard work. It's the only difference is that it doesn't get paid. It's a way. It's still in the age of slavery where it is not paid. Then, of course, movements for gay rights, people who claimed a legitimacy to a sexual orientation that is different from what is considered normative. This started mainly in the US and evolved very powerfully also in Europe. Finally, rights of students and rights to education. Movements that wanted to open up the system of higher education, making it accessible to those with merits and not simply to the privileged people, or also that wanted a change in the content of education. What are we learning? What is the purpose of what we are learning? Why are we learning only what comes from the past and we are not really learning about the present or a future we could imagine? Finally, movements that really claimed sexual freedom, more expansiveness in the practices of love, and in how people relate to one another. So all of these movements were possible under the aegis of the Cold War, and they had very significant transformative effect, especially in the decade of the 60s. On the other hand, the Cold War order also created more disparities between economies that benefited from the technologies that we have talked about based on the production of oil, and those economies that did not. So the economies that benefited from these technologies include the economies of industrialized societies with diversified economies that have many sectors, including, say, agriculture, industry, and service. These include the United States of America, Canada, all the Western European countries, and Australia. Economies that did not benefit from this new resource, oil, the fossil fuel that propelled the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, include the following. The producers of oil, the countries where oil deposits were found and where they were easily accessible, that, as we all know, are mainly the countries of the Middle East. In fact, these countries hardly benefited from this blessing that they had, these easily accessible deposits of oil. Why? Because they became battlefields for those industrial powers who wanted to control the oil trade, and we can look at the Iraq War as an effect of that. The Gulf War and then the subsequent Iraq War as well, because their economies were controlled by oligarchies that did not invest a lot in developing multi-sectorial economies. And so the economies remained one-sector economies that did not really develop the other areas of the economy, including agriculture, including commerce, including services and industrial production of their own. And because, in a way, the presence of Israel as one of the countries that had this multi-sectorial economies within the region was often seen and used as a proxy that the West had in the Middle East to maintain the status quo and to maintain the other Middle Eastern countries, especially the Islamic countries, in a position of being exploited for their oil, but not really move forward toward their own harmonized and integrated development. Other countries, economies that did not benefit in equal ways from the oil economy were former colonies that were now independent but not industrialized yet, including countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. What often happened to these countries is that they were not able to keep their resources within their boundaries and for the use of their land and their people because of superpower interventions. This happened at least 3 times, and we have 3 important examples. It was very difficult in a bipolar world to sustain a politics of non-alignment. If a country, a newly independent country, a former colony wanted to say, I don't want to be on either side, wanted to distance itself from this bipolar tension, it was very difficult to sustain that. And this happened on a number of occasions. For example, when in the mid-50s, Mossadegh was elected in Iran, he wanted precisely to implement this sort of post-colonial national democracy and keep the resources of this very rich country of Iran in the Middle East within the territory and for the people of Iran. But he was taken out by a foreign intervention, and particularly of the CIA. So the same happened to Chile when the President Allende was elected. Eventually he was taken out in a coup, and then a military dictatorship was installed there. And the same thing happened to another major country of Africa, Congo, where President Lumumba was elected and ended up in the same way. So we can see that some of the extreme developments that we observe today, where in a way the seeds of those were planted by this idea that countries that had accessible oil would just simply remain oil reserves for the industrialized countries and not have a life of their own. When we see that, in fact, after the Mossadegh was replaced with the Shah, which was really a puppet regime of the United States, then eventually this resulted in the first theocratic revolution, the revolution of Khomeini, in Iran in 1979, and the first theocratic state, theocratic Muslim state. Finally, there were countries in the USSR where the lack of a market economy stifled competition and therefore made the benefits of all these new technologies not accessible. So we see that in the Cold War order, former colonies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America faced the challenge of creating diversified economies with multiple sectors and a good use of available resources in the face of internal divisions very often as well as the external interference of the superpowers. This happened in Asia. In India, for example, this is a period where India goes through the process of partition, where the country that initially was unified and became independent becomes divided in 3 countries, in the center, India, occupying all the subcontinent, and then to the west and the east, Pakistan and Bangladesh, respectively. This happens because of the internal division between the Hindu majority and the Muslim minorities who demand their own land, their own space in Pakistan and Bangladesh. We observe Vietnam that, as we said, initially was under the very strong influence of China and then became a colony of France, and then for its strategic position became again a victim of US intervention in the Vietnam War, which went along the majority of the years of the decade of the 60s. In Africa, we observe that many former colonies of Great Britain become independent, beginning with Ghana in 1957, then Kenya in 1963. Algeria, a former colony of France, also becomes independent in 1963 after a war, the Algerian War. And we have to see that this is a very symbolic moment, because as much as India was a very significant colony for Great Britain, so was Algeria for France. So it is really the collapse, a very symbolic moment in this collapse of the colonial empires of the European powers. Finally, we look at South Africa, and there we see that already the white minority within the country dominates the situation and enforces the regime of apartheid. Eventually, this comes to an end due to agitation from the black majorities within the country, and also boycott from in the commercial ways, boycott from all people who wanted to deplete the economy of South Africa and so didn't buy its products, for example. Eventually, de Klerk becomes president, and he negotiates with the leader of the black movement, black anti-apartheid movement, Nelson Mandela, the sort of a process of dismantling the regime of apartheid. In Latin America, we see how the United States really practices this politics of intervention, very often sabotaging the other countries' right to self-determination. This happens, for example, in Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas at some point become very powerful, and where the President Reagan uses the profits from a sale of weapons to Iran to actually finance the Contras, who are the prong of the U.S. to sabotage the Sandinista movement, the Sandinista revolution. Overall, we can say that the Cold War order was a period when humankind acquired an unprecedented power over the forces of nature, and that this power produced an awareness of the danger inherent in having this power. For example, manifestations of this danger were the air pollution that was produced from burning coal and oil, the pollution of waterways that was produced and is still produced by the residues of these combustions, the oil wars that were designed to control oil production and trade and the deposits that were more easily accessible, and that ended up producing terrorism. Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL, as a reverberation of the fact that the economies of these regions could not develop in a more organic and integrated way. Also, this era witnessed an exponential growth of the human population, especially in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And here we have a chart of the human population, and therefore related concerns about the sustainability about this growth. We know that in the history of humankind, new technologies multiply the resources, or at least the access that humans have to those resources, and therefore encourage a growth of the population. But what the growth that happened during the Cold War era is really exponential. And then parallel and exponential growth of consumption and the related environmental toxicity, which affects then the human ability to stave off disease due to a weaker immune system. What do I mean by that? Every time every time we eat from or drink from a styrofoam cup and then throw away the styrofoam cup, we are inserting in our environment an element of toxicity that then is not reabsorbed and is not recycled, and that will store as toxicity that then will make our immune systems weaker, and therefore will make the human population less capable of staving off disease. So we see how consumption really has an environmental effect besides all the other effects that it has. So in this era also, what grew is the awareness of how fossil fuel economies are a threat to the balance of life on the third planet. This threat coming in the form of environmental pollution, eventually global warming, and the climate change phenomena that ensue from this warming. And also an awareness of the multiple challenges in shifting to renewable energy sources. Before, the biota of the only planet we have goes all up in smoke. So as we sum up this Cold War era, we see that at this time the world is we see that at this time the awareness of these challenges and of these threats is not really widespread. It exists in scientific circles, but many people are not yet aware of the entity of the threat and the magnitude of the challenges, and the political will to act on these challenges is not present yet. So finally, in talking about this bipolar world, this Cold War order, the era of the Cold War, we may wonder how it ended, how it came about that it ended. So it really ended with the dissolution of what President Reagan called, quote unquote, the evil empire, namely the USSR. So why was this empire evil, according to President Reagan and many others? And which empire survived? By and large, one can say that it's a good thing for empires to dissolve. That's what they're supposed to do. At some point, they're supposed to just dissolve and collapse and recycle into something else. So, my thought is that perhaps the USSR was not such an evil empire, since it sort of dissolved of its own accord. And so let's briefly look at this dissolution. First, we observed that in 1953, Stalin died, and the whole Soviet Union went through a process of de-Stalinization. Eventually, Khrushchev came into power, and he started to release all the political prisoners that were locked up in Siberia, and also proclaimed a strategy or a politics of peaceful coexistence with the other pole of the bipolar order, namely with the United States. And in fact, that was also the time when President Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was president, and his Secretary of State, McNamara, came up with this idea that if the nuclear arsenals had been used at any moment, this would have resulted in mutually assured destruction. The acronyms as MAD. In other words, it would have been an insane thing to do. And so there was resonance in the other pole of the bipolar order to this peaceful coexistence, to this effort of creating a detente or a peaceful coexistence. Nonetheless, in 1956, the Hungarian people, the people of Hungary, a country of Eastern Europe, a very prominent country in that region, demanded democracy. However, the Kremlin sent tanks to Budapest, and those upheavals were repressed. In 1968, we have another episode where the people of Czechoslovakia reclaimed some forms of democracy, And so we have the Prague Spring. At that time, the leader of the Kremlin was Brezhnev, and he, with his tanks, reaffirms control over allied countries. Simultaneously, the awareness of mad, mutually assured destruction encourages what is known as the SALT talks, strategic arms limitation talks. So these were talks between leaders in the USSR and the USA to limit strategic arms. This is a euphemism for nuclear bombs. By example, in other words, saying, if we agree not to escalate our arsenals, then we lead by examples, and others won't want to also stock so many nuclear bombs. These are the SALT treaties that continue from 1972 to 1979, even though the peak of the detente is now finished. However, they are also undermined by the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan that started a war in 1979, a war that lasted for 9 years. We have to remember that during this war is when the Mujahideen, or the jihadists, were formed, because the USA armed people who wanted to resist the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, and then eventually when the Soviets left, these arms were used to arm the jihads that we know and the various terrorist organizations that became rooted in that region, including the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Okay, so another factor very important in this dissolution of the empire of socialism comes from the economic problems of non-market economies. Okay. When Gorbachev came to power in the 90s, he declared that he wanted to withdraw from the Cold War and gradually create an open market economy in the Soviet Union, maintaining the Soviet Union united in all its different parts, but really gradually introducing elements of a market economy. See, so this was the perestroika, or new course, a gradual introduction of a market economy, and then glasnost, which means transparency. Why? Because if you don't have an open market economy, you're going to have a black market economy, something that is not transparent, something that is hidden. Why? Because people will try to get a hold of what they want, even if it's not sold in the state economy stores. So that was the intention of Gorbachev, who was a moderate. Again, he wanted to keep the Soviet Union together, but wanted to change the course of its politics. Okay. Eventually, though, all the countries that were under the aegis of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, the regimes in those countries that were backed by the Soviet Union collapsed. And that included Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and East Germany. That's how we come to the fall of the Berlin Wall, because at this point the Soviet-controlled regime of East Germany collapses, and so the two parts of Germany become reunited again, and so there's no reason for a wall that divides the city of Berlin anymore, and that happens in 1989. However, the forces of moderation led by Gorbachev that wanted a gradual transition to a diverse part market economy did not prevail. And eventually, all of the republics that were part of the USSR opted out of the Soviet system, and so then the empire dissolved. There were also very strong pressures from the United States to introduce a market economy, but in ways that were not gradual. There was a pressure to do it quickly, to do it overnight. And that had very negative effects, because in an economy that hasn't had an open market for over 50 years, things have, change has to be introduced gradually to be sustainable. And if it's introduced too fast, it can create very, very aberrant forms of capitalism. For example, and something that it manifested in Russia especially is what is called the kleptocapitalism. What is kleptocapitalism? So, suppose that I am the Minister of Transportation in Russia. All of a sudden, everything that belongs to the state doesn't belong to the state anymore because there is no state. So I can simply say, okay, now I own all the railways of Russia. I can sell them and leave the country. And this is what happened in many cases in those years in Russia when the moderates did not prevail, and therefore the transformation happened in very, very violent ways. So this is how the evil empire dissolves, thus proving that it did what empires are supposed to do, namely recycle and become something else. So we now come to the 6th chapter of part 7 of our brief global history. This 6th chapter really focuses on the world that we are part of today. The title of the chapter is A World Without Borders, and I would like to add a world with one empire, the empire of financial capital, and one untapped resource, the resource of love. So in a way, as we finish this excursion through the past, and we take this glance at the now, at the moment, we can bring in the thematic perspective that has accompanied us so far, the study of the humanities from the point of view of love. So the focus at this time is on the world at the turn of the 2nd millennium and shortly after. This is a world empowered by a growing awareness of new local and global disparities, opportunities, and challenges. So let's look at the growing disparities first. There's a growing disparity in our world between the poor and the new class of the super rich that has been created by the digital economy and financial capitalism. In a way, in our world, the rich are becoming richer and the poor are becoming poorer. And that happens within each country, within each economy. It happens globally and it happens at many global levels. So in a way, for the countries that were based in a strong middle class, this results in the erosion of this, a very significant erosion of this middle class. In general, it results in the 99% feeling dominated by this 1% of the super privileged and the super rich. Another important growing disparity is that between the economies and countries that burn excessive amounts of fossil fuels and produce the resulting global warming, and the countries and economies that suffer most intensely from the climate change and its ensuing disasters. And this, of course, affects primarily the neo and post-colonial countries and economies, as well as the indigenous populations within these countries. Now we can look at some of the opportunities that are in front of us. One of the great opportunities of our age is a manifestation of a new interconnected planetary consciousness. This consciousness deploys itself in cyberspace, and this consciousness can collectively address the challenges. We can observe that today cyberspace connects individual consciousness to one another. So these consciousness connected in a form of planetary consciousness can know how to meet the challenges, how to address the challenges of our age, but can they get into action about it? That is the big question. Okay. Another great opportunity for our time is the option for political leaders of our time to practice political power so as to get the new super rich to use their now hidden capital to underwrite the green economy the world and humanity needs at this point to survive. What if we had political leaders with the courage to tell these super rich people, look, we need your money because we need to build solar panels, because we need to really power our economy with renewable resources, and we have the technologies, we just need your money to do that. And if they succeeded, what would the world look like? So then we look at some of the challenges. Here are some of the challenges. A human population of about 7 billion people and counting, since 7 billion was reached in 2005. This growth of one species, this growth in numbers of one species can severely challenge planetary balance. There is only so many resources on this one planet, and so this exponential growth is an inherent challenge to the balance of life on the planet. In fact, we do know of previous very powerful species that eventually became extinguished, like the dinosaurs, because they were too powerful. Another important challenge is that of powering world economies while keeping the remaining fossil fuels in the ground, right? We have now burned so much fossil fuels that if we keep doing it, the whole planet will burn up in smoke. But then how are we going to stop burning them when they actually power the economies of our planet? It's a big challenge. Another big challenge is containing terrorism while protecting civil liberties and minimizing incarceration and state violence. We have seen how, in a way, terrorist organizations like ISIL and its antecedent Al-Qaeda are sort of side effects of the lack of organic and integrated development of multi-sector economies in the oil-rich countries, in the countries of the Middle East that were used as oil tanks. But then, once these organizations exist, how are we going to contain them without eliminating civil liberties and without really implementing an extreme system of surveillance that, for example, creates, increases the prison population or allows the police to practice violence, especially often against the poor or the racially diverse. Another major challenge is keeping borders open while containing mass migrations and the new forms of servitude they encourage. And I remember, when we all saw that image of this 2-year-old boy who drowned in the Mediterranean, and eventually the body washed ashore, and he drowned as the effect of his family and masses of other people trying to migrate on very dangerous boats through the Mediterranean to the countries where there is less terrorism, to the countries that are not dominated by, say, ISIL or Al-Qaeda. Clearly these migrants, when they arrive, they don't have many options, and often this brings back forms of servitude that we all would like to eliminate, but that come back because of the state of emergency and disarray that these masses of people incur in. Another big challenge, how to promote transitions to non-fossil fuel-based economies when most resources are still invested in the interminable wars that serve to uphold fossil fuel economies. In other words, if we cannot let go of those wars that really continue and maintain the hegemony over the oil-rich countries, right, over these tanks, then we don't have the resources to really power a different kind of economy, to implement the technologies that already exist on a large scale. And finally, when we ask, when we see how severe the challenges that we face, that we as humankind and our planet face today, we can summarize them in the challenge of guiding humanity toward the untapped renewable energy of our time. And this energy is love. There are ways to learn to practice love, and there are ways to learn to practice forms of nonviolence that express this love. So that could be a great investment in a sustainable future, is to learn better to practice love and tap into this renewable source of energy. Another challenge is that of creating a new symbiotic relationship between our species and the lover we all share. This lover is known as Earth. Some scientists call it Gaia. It is, in a way, an encouragement, a challenge to treat nature as an ally, treat the environment as a partner with enduring rights, treating the planet, the only planet we have, as a lover, as a hostess that welcomes us in our lives and that therefore deserves our respect, just like every creature that lives on it.